Well, I think thank the chairman. I'd ask my friend from Arizona when he was just describing, we were talking about the issue of the border, and obviously we've got legislation here talking about the impact on local law enforcement. We had a hearing in the Budget Committee last week, which we had testimony from the county attorney of Kinney County, Texas, just south of San Antonio, where he was describing the number of crimes. And I don't know if the gentleman saw the news reports from that hearing in which the county attorney from Kinney County, Texas, one of the main thoroughfares in South Texas, was describing approximately 150 crimes in 2021, which was the, last year of the policies before the Biden administration. And that last year, there were 6,700 crimes, 6,700 crimes. The year before, about 6,300 crimes. The year before that, about 3,000 crimes. There have been 15,000 crimes since 2021. And that is a direct consequence, a direct result of the open borders. It is the people of Kinney County who are left holding the bag. The people of Kinney County, whose law enforcement are the ones who have to go respond to this. It was a Kinney County resident who died because the EMT, the ambulance, couldn't get to that individual because that ambulance, the one ambulance they've got in the county of about 3,000 people, was over dealing with people who are there illegally because they're overwhelmed. Why? Because our borders are wide open and we all know it. Because anybody with eyes can see it. That's the truth. And when we talk about the border and we talk about the fentanyl that the gentleman from Arizona was talking about, and I want to turn it over to him to see if he agrees with me on both that point, and I'm sure he has examples in Arizona that I just described in Kinney County, Texas. But that were we talking about the, why don't we have resources between the ports of entry? And the answer is, oh, well, because Republicans won't fund it. Or is it because the Border Patrol is being used at the places where they're having to process people into the country because of the blatant abuse of asylum and parole laws? Parole, which is supposed to be case by case. Parole, which was 400,000 last year under parole. By the way, how many of those were flown around the country to various places around the United States? All these parole abuses, by the way, had we passed H.R. 2 instead of the fraudulent cover bill the Democrats put forward, which couldn't even get out of the Senate, by the way. I want to blame it on President Trump. They couldn't even get it out of the Senate. They're in the majority. They couldn't even get it moving. That bill would not have dealt with the asylum issues. H.R. 2 would have, and Laken Riley is dead specifically because an individual was paroled into the United States in violation of the law requiring case-by-case analysis. Would the gentleman from Arizona respond to that?
Yeah, a lot to respond to. I'll just tell you in Del Rio, when I've been in Del Rio, talking to their fire chief, he'll tell you the exact same thing. They've got 3 ambulances for that whole region, and many times they'll have 2 ambulances that are taken up with dealing with illegal aliens. They've got the river, they've got drownings, they've got people coming across, and sometimes they basically have put together a team that is 1 ambulance 24/7 to deal with assisting illegal aliens so their own residents get delayed care. Talk to the administrator of the hospital there. He will tell you, yeah, these people get brought in here who are illegally in the country, and our local residents have to go behind them sometimes. Yuma, Arizona, the hospital, they have 1 hospital in a town of about 100,000 people. In that hospital, they'll tell you the exact same thing. Crime is up. They'll tell you the same thing in Cochise County, where in a small town of 20,000 people, every day they have multiple high-speed chases. What from? Illegal aliens, human and drug smuggling. Not through a port of entry, but between the port of entry. Got a video just the other day of, once again, they've started actually, Mr. Roy, I think you can appreciate this, in Arizona, where we don't have fencing in a lot of places, they're literally, I've got a video of them laying down on a barbed wire fence, a ramp where the truck goes up and over. Yep. So you're exactly right. What you're saying is true. And this notion that we're trying to fearmonger, we're not trying to fearmonger. And I just have to point out, can I just point out one other thing that the ranking member from Judiciary said? He basically said, you know, we don't know. Maybe Philadelphia had a deficit in one year, and so they had to cut. So they cut their police department. So what he's essentially saying is it's okay for the local government to cut police funding for whatever reason, but it's not okay to examine that for the federal. And we don't just have 1 year of bad money. We're looking at $35 trillion in national debt. And so you got to take that into account as well. And so I'll yield back to you.
Well, what I would note, and I would just ask the gentleman if he has a similar situation in Arizona, I don't know how much the people of Arizona have had to pay out of their own pocket in order to do the job that the federal government refuses to do. Because I can tell you in Texas, we have spent about $13 billion. $13 billion in Operation Lone Star since 2021 in trying to make sure we do the job the federal government refuses to do. Our DPS troopers are down in South Texas. Our DPS troopers are the ones who are having to police the counties because our local law enforcement can't do the job. Our DPS troopers are not able to be up in North Texas, West Texas, the Panhandle, East Texas. They're not able to be policing our roads, policing the fentanyl traffic up through the cities, which does get in through the ports of entry. Because even if you're capturing X percent of it, you know, Y percent of it is still getting through the ports of entry, and a crap ton is still getting in between the ports of entry. So you need law enforcement to be able to go stop it when it's going up I-35, up through the guts of our cities, or going across I-10, all the way from Houston over to El Paso. Our people are the ones left holding the bag and dealing with that. Our people are the ones who are getting killed. The 6 kids in the school district in which I live and where my family lives who died from fentanyl poisoning last year. I assume the gentleman understands the extent to which Texas, at $13 billion, I assume the people of Arizona have had to spend hundreds of millions, billions, I don't know, of dollars to do the job the federal government refuses to do in our constitutional system of government.
Yeah, we obviously are a much smaller state, about 7 million plus in our state. We haven't had to spend $13 billion. You've got a governor who cares. Our governor in Arizona, the first thing she did is she disbanded our borders task force within our DPS. Second thing she did is she took down barriers that we had that have never come back up. So, and we actually have literally hundreds of miles in Arizona that, I shouldn't say hundreds, we're just under 100 miles that actually have no fence whatsoever, no river, no natural barrier. Why? Because there is a, we've got 2 tribes that don't want any fencing on there. So we have 4-strand barbed wire fence. So the reality is we have folks coming in, and I don't think you'd gotten here yet. I mentioned this in a meeting with Tucson Sector Chief Modlin last week. 2018 to 2021, encounters in the Tucson sector averaged 60,000 a year. It went up to, when our new president came in, it went up to 130,000 the next year, more than double. Then it went up to 250,000. Last year it was up to 380,000. And already they're on pace. They've already they've outpaced the entire last year. They're on pace to go over 700,000 encounters this year. Mr. Roy, that means that there's no place for those people to go. They're getting processed by agents. That's why I can drive along literally miles along the road with no agents ever coming into contact, but I can sure tell you, I come in contact with the illegal aliens crossing.
And so this legislation, the Police Our Border Act, in order to get more information on the impact on law enforcement is useful in the current environment where we're dealing with not just federal law enforcement, but state and local. And I would note that, you know, we've got, I can't remember, I don't have the stats in front of me. If I can get them, I'll try to present them to the committee or to the gentleman, but thousands of pounds, I can safely say that, thousands of pounds of fentanyl has been intercepted by DPS, Texas DPS, who have been deployed by Texas to South Texas to deal with the fact that we're not intercepting it at the border. So that's the reality of what we're having to deal with and what we're having to spend money on. So the impact on law enforcement is very real. I can tell you, in talking to DPS agents and the head of DPS for Texas, that they're having to do that work, and therefore they're not doing other work. So I'm assuming that there's similar impact in Arizona, but I'll move to one other topic, which is just the issue of generally on crime. And we've been talking about it. The gentlelady before referred to that there's no issue with the defunding of police, right? Well, the fact of the matter is the rhetoric and the actions of federal leaders on this topic, in addition to what we've seen by local leaders on this topic, has been very clear and obvious, right? There's been, you know, very obvious statements back in the 2020 timeframe with the issues involving Mr. Floyd and in 2021, and then all that followed from that. You know, Cori Bush's statement was very public about defunding the police. I don't have to enter it in the record, but it was very public. In fact, it caused Nancy Pelosi in an interview with George Stephanopoulos to say, quote, with all due respect in the world to Cori Bush, that is not the position of the Democratic Party. Yet if you go through and look at quote after quote after quote of numerous members of the Democratic Party and the actions of Democrats across the country, it has led to a massive defunding of police around the country. It is undeniably and factually true. In Austin, where we had a significant defunding of the police in Austin, we are now 350 police below the level we're supposed to have, below the level we had 4 or 5 years ago. We have rampant crime skyrocketing, the highest levels of crime we've had in Austin forever. Again, that is a state and local issue. I grant that. The issue is that our Democratic colleagues use the rhetoric of defunding the cops and have been talking about that for the better part of 4 or 5 years. And in fact, and I'll give the gentleman from New York, with whom we've had some incredible agreement lately with respect to FISA and other issues, which has been nice. It fell just short on that one amendment. I wish we had passed. But
212 to 212.
I know, it's 212 to 212, I know. But there was the event, and I'm sure the gentleman knows this and will respond to it, but I want to give him the chance to, where the gentleman joined with our colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, in a letter involving the with respect to the Metropolitan Transportation Authority about officers in the subways to reduce crime. And it was a letter to say that, well, we don't need that funding. And the gentleman signed it. This is a letter in roll call. There's a story on this that says the letter to then Governor Andrew Cuomo opposed a plan to put 500 new Metropolitan Transportation Authority officers in the subways to reduce crime. Your colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, said she and her fellow members wrote that the MTA funding for increased police presence in the subways would be better spent on, quote, desperately needed resources like subway bus maintenance and service improvements. The subway system is now safer than before. And I'll let the gentleman respond, but I mean, observers and people that I know looking at the evidence and obviously the things that we're seeing happening on subways, and I'm a big fan of going to New York and riding the mass transit in New York and have been historically. But there's a lot of concerns by a lot of people being raised about the state of affairs there, in addition to what's happening in D.C. But I want to give the gentleman a chance to respond.
There is indeed a lot of concern, and properly so. And I don't know what Ms. Ocasio-Cortez's motive was for supporting that decrease. I supported it because it was part of an arrangement, as I alluded to before, to shift resources to the Department of Social Services because it was judged that we needed social services for the mentally ill people in the subway system, and that the Department of Social Services was better equipped to provide those services than was the police department. The police are not trained in how to deal with mentally ill people, at least not as well as people from the Department of Social Services. So we took I forget how much money it was, we took a certain amount of money from the police department and shifted it to the Department of Social Services to provide, in a better way, we thought, what was necessary in the subway.
Does the gentleman think that's been working out?
We still have problems, but I think it's somewhat better than it was.
Well, I would be respectful and just say, look, this legislation, the stuff that we have before us, is trying to make sure that we're clear that D.C., where we have a very clear impact on what's happening here, that we're making sure that we're safe in our nation's capital, that broadly speaking, we're making sure we're getting the information about the burden on law enforcement with respect to the border, which is having a massive impact, and then ensuring that we're condemning calls for defunding the police around the country, and that is distinct from what we've been dealing with and talking about some of the issues involving federal agencies. And one thing that was posited earlier, that it was, quote, our job to fund federal law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there is a role for the federal government in coordinating interstate crime, interstate criminal activities, and coordinating among the states to do that. But the extent to which we have a call for a national police is not something that is, I think, central to the constitutional framework, and is, in fact, something that we ought to be working carefully to stay out of the way of local and state governments to be able to police crime and coordinate across states rather than trying to consume power into the federal government. I was happy to work just this week to stop legislation that I thought was going to overly criminalize and federalize crime. I had some conversations with my Democratic colleagues along those lines of trying to prohibit, to limit that. So hopefully there's some ways in which we can agree, and I'll yield back to the chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York for questions.
Thank you, Mr.